So welcome to today's Advocata Conversation. I have the distinct pleasure of speaking with Dr. Asanga Welikala, who is a lecturer in public law and head of the public law department at the University of Edinburgh's Law School. And today's conversation will be about constitution and the recent opposition's proposal for an amendment to the existing constitution known as the 21st Amendment. So if I can start off, Asanga, and ask you to introduce yourself to us. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Murtaza. Thank you for the invitation. Good to see you, and very nice to join this series of Advocata Conversations. I'm a public lawyer. I'm a comparative constitutional law academic, as well as a practitioner. I grew up entirely in Sri Lanka. I went to school at St. Thomas's, and after school, I went off to the UK for my first degree. I came back to Sri Lanka after that, where I was working for the Centre for Policy Alternatives for very many years in the field of constitutional law, constitutional reform. This was the period of the Norwegian peace process and all of that. And while based there, I was also working abroad on a number of other constitutional reform processes, including an extended stint in the United Nations Assistance Missions for Iraq in Baghdad, drafting the Iraqi constitution, and many other constitution-making processes around the world. Then I came to Edinburgh first to do my PhD, now more than 10 years ago. And my intention was, of course, to go back to what I was doing after my PhD, but I didn't. Edinburgh is a easy place to fall in love with. I also began teaching, which I didn't expect to enjoy very much, but I did. And then I was very lucky to have been offered tenure almost before I had graduated from my PhD, after I had submitted. So I stayed on. So I'm, in addition to teaching here, UK and Scottish public law and number of courses on comparative constitutional law, I'm also the director of the Edinburgh Centre for Constitutional Law, which permits me to carry on my other work in advising constitution-making processes. And the most recent ones that I have worked on, in addition to, of course, Sri Lanka, which I've never given up working on, are the constitutions of Gambia and Myanmar.
Thank you for that, Asanga. So for the benefit of our audience, can you tell us exactly what is a constitution and what it hopes to achieve?
Well, that's a very big question. So let's try and answer this in a succinct way as possible. For me, we have to understand the idea of the constitution, or the word constitution, in at least two senses: a legal sense and a political sense. Right? And in most countries, the UK is one of these very rare and few exceptions in the world today that doesn't have a written constitution, but everybody else does, and we have always had one. Certainly from our post-independence existence, we've had a written constitution, and that is what is known as the legal constitution, the written document called the constitution. And that provides the formal framework for the system of government, the rights of the citizen, the checks and balances between the organs of government, and all of that. And that, in that sense, when you look at that document, the legal constitution, the legal instrument called the constitution, you will see the formal constitution of the country. But if you just look at the piece of paper called the constitution, and try to understand how the governance of a country works, you're not going to get very far. And that's the case anywhere in the world, whether more or less democratic the country is. So that is the reason why you have to understand constitution in a political sense also. And when you understand the political constitution, what that simply means is that you're not only looking at the values and the habits and the mores of a society that animates the culture of politics and of government, but also the informal practices through which government is actually carried on. If the political culture places a great premium on strong leadership, for example, or if the political culture places, or the majority of a political culture places a great premium on a very nationalistic sense of their own self, and that leads to minority others being subordinated or ill-treated. These are all aspects of the politics of the country, which also have a constitutional significance. So in the way that I look at constitution, I will look at both the legal and the political constitution. Every country has a legal and a political constitution. We need to look at both in order to understand what the particular culture of constitutionalism in every country is. And in the Sri Lankan context also, that is the way that I would approach it. So you would obviously, the starting point would be, and for lawyers, that is the starting and the end point, to look at the document known as the legal document known as the Constitution, but that is not sufficient. You need to have a more expansive capacity to look at the actual practice of politics and governing, and indeed the cultural values of that society, in order to understand how the constitution of that country actually works. And in that sense, it goes back to very old ideas about how the word constitution has been understood, both in the Eastern and the Western tradition. Aristotle talked about something called the body politic, which was then revitalized by Hobbes in the 17th century, 17th century, certainly in the English-speaking tradition of political theory. And when you look at also the way that the word country, nation, constitution, and you must be careful not to sort of understand history by modern understandings. But when you look at the way that our monarchical state is talked about in the Vamsa tradition, for example, or in the Buddhist teachings and so on, that's the very idea. They're not looking at formal positivist written legal documents, but the constitution of the state as the habits of the heart and the habits of the mind of a political community about how they're governed.
So can you explain to us what the difference is between drafting an entire new constitution as opposed to these various amendments? Because if you look at the more recent amendments, it looks like they are major changes. You are having a profound change to the character of the leader. How should we think about this?
Yeah, good. I mean, I think, yes, it's not always, though, Murtaza, that you can have a formal repeal and replacement, a constitution-making process, right? It used to be thought, particularly among liberal constitutionalist scholars and so on, that the only way to get out of this rut that we are in is to get the country to agree to a formal break with the past, where you make a constitution through an inclusive and participatory process, and you have to depart from the bad constitutions of the present and the past. So it's transformative in that sense. You mark a historical break between the past, the present, and the future. Now, that's fine as long as it works. That is something that we have tried to do. Chandrika Bandaranaike, Kumaratunga's presidency was all about trying to do that. The peace process under Ranil Wickremesinghe may have led to something like that. The last occasion in which something like that was attempted was the Yahapalani dispensation in 2015 to 19. But what has also happened in the meantime in the scholarship around comparative constitution making is to question the very need for this stuff. It's not always, that this sort of idealized constitution making process happens and then produces these wonderful constitutions inspired by experiences like the transition in South Africa, for example, in the mid-90s and so on. But then when you look at we've had the experience of those things, even where the process seems to have gone very well and a beautiful new constitution has been made. Now we have the advantage of looking back and saying, well, how has that actually worked? And when you now look at the performance of the South African Constitution, for example, from between 1996 and now, you can see that much of the optimism that greeted it at the beginning is not particularly well placed. It hasn't become more equal. It hasn't become more democratic. It hasn't become less corrupt. All these things are there. So there's been sort of in the academy certainly a look at this revolutionary break with the past model of constitution making, and I have contributed to this debate quite actively myself. Towards a more incremental way of thinking about these things, right? So don't worry about it. If constitutional amendments are the way to go, then let's do that way, right? What is possible at a particular time and place, subject to, of course, that you're doing it with some reference to consistency with principle, could be good. And I think where we are in 2022, particularly because of the fact that whatever change that will happen, if it happens, will happen as a result of this unprecedented democratic protests that we have seen. I mean, we have never seen citizens of all classes, ethnicities, religions, provinces and urban citizens all coming together and for an unorganized, spontaneous protests. The messages are remarkably consistent. It's that we will not be divided on race and religion anymore. We need accountability. We need democracy. We need a system of government that works for us. We will have no more of this extractive corruption. Remarkably similar whether the protest slogans and chants are heard in Jaffna or Gaul or Colombo or Kandy. So I think we are reaching that position where there is a social demand for that. And right now, if the way to do this is to do it by way of a constitutional amendment, then let's do it like that. Of course, remember, I mean, even if it's a constitutional amendment, it requires a two-thirds majority in parliament. That means a two-thirds majority of elected representatives, which reflect the opinion of the country, have to agree to it. A 21st Amendment, we don't know what the Supreme Court might say about it, but it may even order a referendum on it. If that is the case, then we have an opportunity, the whole country has an opportunity to vote on it. So in these ways, even though it leaves the architecture, the overall framework of the 78 Constitution intact, it does, as you said, through an amendment, affect very fundamental changes to the system of government. And if you change it from presidentialism to parliamentarism, that is a massive change. But it will be done with a very high threshold of representatives, parliamentary representatives of the people, and with the opportunity for the people themselves to debate and vote on it in a referendum. That might well happen. So in that sense, I think I'm relaxed about the fact that we don't have to undertake wholesale replacement. Even through the mechanism of amendments, we can actually do good things.
Asanga, you have been quite critical about the current executive presidential system. Can you articulate for us what the reasons are?
Yeah, thank you, Murtaza. I think that's a really important question, because that is probably the central most constitutional question that has absorbed me for a number of years now, and certainly since the dominance of the Rajapaksas began with the 18th and 20th amendments and their general style of very executive-centric governance. I am, as you rightly pointed out, I'm a critic. I'm an opponent of presidentialism. I think it's a terrible idea for a constitutional idea for the particular cultural and political conditions of a place like Sri Lanka, and I'll explain why. But let's try and tackle this in terms of two sets of questions. The first are the original arguments that were made in favor of a presidential constitution by the architect, J.R. Jayawardena. And then look at our experience under it now for 45 years. So JR's problem was that in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, he was looking at our political landscape, and he saw that this was a very vibrant and thriving democracy that was changing governments at most elections. Maybe not everyone, but almost every election there was a change of government. And prime ministers and cabinets had to appease their backbenchers. Their MPs had to were constantly trying to deliver the goods for their voters. And in all of this, he saw a very inefficient way of doing things, where it was constantly the political considerations were getting in the way of sound economic management, long-term economic planning, and the strong, consistent, long-term leadership that is required for a developing post-colonial country. His interest was to develop the country along with every other leader of the post-colonial world in that era. So in that sense, it didn't begin with any sort of sinister, I don't think, sinister motivation to become a dictator or anything like that. Even though you could argue that JR as a personality probably had some authoritarian tendencies. He was very impatient. He was a highly intelligent man who didn't suffer fools very gladly. So you could see him wanting to get on with things rather than spend hours discussing with intellectual inferiors and all of doing the patronage kind of politics. So you see where this is coming from, very much. And there was a part of me, is a part of me that is sympathetic to that. When you every time you engage with the political world in Sri Lanka, you see, what somebody like Jaya would have been thinking, because of the lack of capacity and all of that. So he, though, felt that if I had control, and the other thing that happened to him was in 1958, when the first very serious communal riots happened. What he saw was the Prime Minister, Mr. Bandaranaike, effectively totally paralyzed by the crisis. He didn't know what to do. It was a complete failure of leadership. The Prime Minister and the Cabinet essentially abdicated power. They were not in control of the country. The whole thing was spreading like wildfire, and everybody was very scared about what was going to happen. Anarchy might follow at this rate because the government was not governing. Very fortunately, there was this hugely experienced and competent Governor General, Sir Oliver Gunathilaka, who essentially just took charge and just ran the country like a dictator and brought it under control in short order. And if Oliver was not there at that time, Jaya looked at this and saw the awesome possibilities of power like that. Of one-man rule, enlightened, but one-man rule. The other great influence in 1958, as these things were actually happening in Ceylon for Jaya, was the Algerian Crisis, in the French Empire's last very bloody battle for survival in Algeria, which brought down essentially the many governments and the Fourth Republic of France. As a result of the loss of Algeria and the humiliation caused to the French there, the French metropolitan state was in a complete state of collapse and paralysis. Until then, once again, the great war hero, General Charles de Gaulle, stepped forward and said, I'm going to rescue France, and we need to change the constitution. We are essentially establishing a republican version of the monarchical constitution, where I am the grand president of the Republic. And I will run the show, and I'll take control, which he did, and against all this dysfunction of parliamentary politics, he did. So Jaya learned huge lessons from all of this. So, and he made the argument that, look, I am a Democrat. I don't want to abolish parliament or elections or anything like that. That must go on. He has explicitly mentioned all of that. But at the same time, we do not have a governmental system that provides for the strong executive that we need to deal with our problems. So this is why I'm going to enact a presidential constitution. Those were the reasons. So in terms of the original arguments, we should have got from this constitution executive stability, we should have got peace and good order, and we should have got rapid economic growth and development. None of which, of course, has happened in the 45 years since the presidential constitution was there, including in the initial period in which Mr. Jayabardhan himself was the president. Right? Our war completely worsened. We went from a low-level, low-intensity guerrilla conflict into a full-blown armed conflict during presidency. There's a causal relationship between presidential government and the way that the extra institutionalization of conflict happened. We have performed nowhere near and not significantly better under the previous years of parliamentary system and subsequently under presidentialism on the economic front, when all around us we have seen in the developing world comparable countries shooting ahead in terms of economic performance. So presidentialism has not been a solution to our chronic underperformance on that front either. And what about stability? We've had war, we've had southern rebellions, and we have had authoritarianism. The president, the person who becomes president, always thinking that more and more authoritarianism is the answer to everything, with the result that our democracy has suffered. Massive scale invasions of personal liberty, a very, very corrosive effect on our traditions of the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary. So in that sense also, our more intangible heritage of democracy that we have had has been attacked and damaged by presidentialism. And the fourth point is that by incentivizing both these messianic sort of leadership styles, I am the only guy who can save this country, right? Everybody from Jayabardhan to President Premadasa to Mahinda Rajapaksa to Gotabaya Rajapaksa say this kind of thing. This attitude that one guy is our savior, I mean, that has to absolutely... It is there in our culture, but it is aggravated by the presidential form of government, and that we have to stop that. It's like taking the bottle of whiskey away from the alcoholic. It's that kind of analogy, right? If you have that tendency, we have to see that we don't make it worse, but we make it better. And the third point is the majority, the ultra majoritarianism. Presidents have to win a 50% plus one popular vote of the whole country. And originally the argument was made, and especially by minority parties, particularly by the Muslim parties, that, well, this gives us a leverage space. Because when the two-party system was dominant, SLFP, UNP, roughly about, the two candidates from these two big parties and their coalitions would roughly get about 40%. The winning presidential candidate has to get that 50% plus one, and that's the space where they will negotiate, bargain with the minority parties and get their support. And in that way, minority parties exchange vote blocks for patronage, influence, and whatever that they want to do with it. Not a great way of doing it. I think it's that kind of vote block clientelism is a terrible way of thinking about democracy. But well, there we go. But the real issue is in the last 25 years, we have seen that argument does not hold water either, because the moment you have the Mahinda Rajapaksa type SLPP type phenomenon, which actually sees its route to power in the unification of the majority, or sufficient numbers of the majority community, in order to take them above the 50% plus one mark. What happens is two things. One is that they ratchet up the nationalism of the majority community, and that is why we have seen that sort of ultra intolerant nationalism surrounding themselves with Buddhist priests who are willing to sort of do that. And then you have to have others. Any democracy has to have an opponent. And who becomes the opponent? The scapegoats are the minorities. And we have seen the consequences of that. And I, in that sense, also in terms of thinking of democracy in a plural, ethnically, religiously plural society, presidentialism has turned out to be a terrible idea. It is time for it to go. It has not performed on any of the things that it is supposed to be performing on. If it did something, we could say, right, okay, maybe we trade in the quality of our democracy a little bit if we are getting very rapid Singapore, Malaysia style development, or even Bangladesh style development nowadays. That's not happening either. So, what's the point? And this over concentration of power and the dilution of checks and balances then incentivizes corruption. Around the president, you have these parties formed and other networks and all the rest of it, and the state is captured, and the state then starts functioning completely on corrupt lines for the benefit of the narrow and wider coterie around the president, thus sort of completely taking our corruption indices off the charts. So yes, for all these reasons, presidentialism has to go. Absolutely has to go. But remember, of course, that the alternative is not a panacea. As I said, there is a legal and a political constitution. The abolition of presidentialism is a change to the legal constitution. But hopefully, with that change also will come changes to the political constitution, such that our culture itself starts changing away from, we are never going to eliminate corruption. We are never going to eliminate inefficiency. But at least we have an institutional system of government that gives a different structure of incentives rather than the incentives that that presidentialism gives, which are all bad ones.
Yeah, thank you for that. The opposition has presented an amendment to the Constitution, the 21st Amendment in Parliament. I believe that you must have studied it. And can you elaborate for us what the objectives are of that 21st Amendment?
Sure. The SJB-led opposition and its allies, that particular bill that was presented on the 21st of April, last Thursday, by the General Secretary of the SJB to Parliament, to the Secretary General. That is the bill that I think every reform-minded Sri Lankan citizen at this moment has to get behind. Not these other documents that are coming, because they can't be taken seriously, these other things, because they seem more to be sort of strategic gestures for the pursuit of other aims, and they just don't do enough. And if you're trying to tinker with certain aspects of the presidency, we'll take away some of the bad things about the 20th Amendment, we'll bring back some of the good things about the 19th. That's a level of tinkering that we are done with, because that's what we have been doing for the last several amendments, right? 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th amendments are all tinkering with while keeping the problem alive. It's not attacking the cancer at the source, and that is what we should be doing, and that is what the SJB bill proposes to do. So in terms of its objectives, I think the speech given by the leader of the opposition was a particularly good one on that day. I think it would be good for interested people to sort of go back to that and listen to what he said. And I thought he framed it fairly well, because he said that abolition is absolutely a necessity, but abolition does not mean the replacement of presidential authoritarianism with the tyranny of parliament or of the cabinet. We have to think about abolition in the context of reintroducing the values of constitutional democracy back to our constitutional life. So you need to have the separation of powers, strong checks and balances, to ensure that the three branches function in some sort of equilibrium that gives them sufficient power to do what they have to do. So they can't be so checked that they can't actually do their job. So they must have that sort of the sufficient power, but at the same time, they don't have too much power. So that there's a good system of checks and balances that delivers efficient, transparent, accountable government, professional governance. We are taxpayers. That's the price that we pay, and we need to get bang for our buck from this system, right? At every election, we employ these guys to go and do this work, and through our taxes, we pay for it. We won't go to a shop and buy a product or buy a service from a private company and be satisfied if we get the kind of service that we get for the money that we pay for our governance. So that's why it has to be efficient and transparent and accountable, and that's sort of the idea behind where we are going to get. And in that sense, the fact that the SJB and its allied parties have come to the realization that we need to do abolition, because the abolition of presidentialism was very much a niche thing that a few constitutional lawyers and others used to talk about for a very long time, right? But now it has become a mainstream thing, partly because of this unique moment created by the protests. And in terms of those objectives, those are all the right ones. And that is why we should be focusing on that. It does a number of other things, and I'm sure we'll talk about that shortly.
What does it propose with regard to the president? What will happen to the presidency?
Yeah, so the executive presidential system is abolished. That means we return to a parliamentary executive system. There are many ways: parliamentary democracy, parliamentary government, cabinet government. They all mean the same thing, right? Essentially a parliamentary democracy, not a presidential democracy. Now, there will be such a thing as an office of the president. Now, in parliamentary systems are either monarchical or republican, right? So in the monarchical ones, there will be a king or queen, as we have here in the UK. But there are very many other republics in the Commonwealth too, who has a head of state called a president, like India or Singapore. And the president is the head of state, which is a ceremonial office and title. There will be other sort of styles and titles associated with that traditionally, like commander-in-chief, but these are all ceremonial titular titles. The president has no substantive power of governing. But that does not mean that the president of the republic becomes a totally useless figure for whom we wonder why we are even paying salary. Because you need a head of state. There has to be an office and a person who is in that office, who can inspire the whole country, who can embody the national identity, who can represent the country as a whole to the international community. So in terms of the soft power, in terms of the symbolic value of a ceremonial president, it's a very, very important role. Now think of the prestige that attaches to somebody like the Queen of the United Kingdom by virtue of the person that she is. And even more in the Republican world, the Irish president. These are, people, or the Indian president. They're people of great distinction, scientists and, others who have done, but who are also able to sort of, represent the softer side of the whole country. And that's a very important soft power symbolic role. The president will have, if the 21st Amendment goes through, so that the president becomes that kind of head of state, a ceremonial head of state. He or she will have some formal roles in government, but that will be acting on the advice of the Prime Minister. So the appointment of the Prime Minister, the appointment of other ministers, the dissolution of Parliament, the granting of honours, the granting of pardons, etc., remain formally something that the President does, but in most cases the President does that on the advice of the Prime Minister, not in the exercise of his or her own discretion. And the Prime Minister gives responsible advice on the basis of a cabinet consensus to the President to act in particular ways. In that sense, then, so that's the President. Shall I just carry on to talk about where executive power lies in a parliamentary system? So, substantive executive power, the power to determine the general direction and control of the government, to put in place, implement a policy program for which a party is elected, that's government. That is done by not one person, but by a group, a small group of 25 people. I would have preferred that if the cabinet is even lower than that. I think about 15 would have been more than sufficient for Sri Lanka. But it seems to have been the case in the negotiations in the drafting of the bill that we will lower it from 30 to, nothing to 30 and then 30 to 25.
That all that says is it's the maximum, right? It doesn't mean that the cabinet has to be 25.
No, absolutely not. Yeah, no more than 25, right? So you can actually, a sensible prime minister can actually, say, we don't need this. And we'll have a smaller cabinet of 25. And the provision to 25 other non-cabinet ministers are also there. And that again can be much lower, no more than. So I want to emphasize that when executive power, the great difference of executive power being vested in one office and who is one person, and executive power being vested in an institution which is a collective body, that's very important. That means that one-man rule cannot happen, right? The prime ministers may be very dominant figures. They may be able to dominate their parties, they will dominate their cabinet and all of that. And we would see, across the world when we look at leaders like Margaret Thatcher or Tony Blair or Jawaharlal Nehru or Lee Kuan Yew or Pierre Trudeau, from across the Commonwealth. These were people who had massive, charisma and the ability to dominate. But they couldn't take decisions on their own. They had to sit down, discuss with peers. The prime minister is primus inter pares, the first among equals. Unless cabinet decides, you can't take them. That's why cabinet has to be collective, but at the same time sufficiently small enough to be able to have the best possible talent there. You can discuss policy. You can disagree. You can ensure that the prime minister doesn't get his or her own way all the time. That the decisions are made, because decisions when they are made in a small committee are always better than somebody just deciding what I think is the best thing. So that's very important. So collectively, cabinet then becomes the chief instrument of the government. And the other important thing about cabinet government is the confidence principle, which is to say that a prime minister and a cabinet can only go on governing the country as long as they enjoy the confidence of parliament. And that is usually expressed through having control of a majority in parliament. It doesn't always have to be there. There are minority governments and so on. Let's not go into those complications right now, but established as the main principle. The confidence principle is entirely important, and I'll illustrate that by saying, so the moment the prime minister and the cabinet can only go on as long as they enjoy the confidence of parliament. When they lose the confidence of parliament, if they lose their governing majority, if they lose a vote of no confidence, if they lose the votes on their budgets, which are considered confidence matters, you have to go. And that is very, very important, because that imposes this daily duty of accountability, right? And it's not only that large principle, but the way that within parliaments, how that is given effect. The prime minister has to come and in the well of the house justify what they are doing. All ministers have to do that. There are questions, there are committees. And so you're bringing the executive completely into a much more accountable and responsive arrangement than a president who sits remotely in a presidential secretariat. Nobody knows what he's doing. Nobody knows who he's appointing. All of that kind of stuff. So let's illustrate that by what has happened. Now, since 2019, we had this man who won a major mandate for strong government, almost authoritarian government, saying, I'm going to govern, I know, and my guys are these people associated with me in the Vyatmaga movement. These are the technocrats that I'm going to use, and all of that. And within less than 2.5 years, we have ended up in the biggest economic catastrophe that has hit our country ever since we became independent. That is because the president is unaccountable. The finance minister even assumed that this whole element of the family dimension was not there. Never comes to parliament, is never forced to come to parliament, doesn't have to justify anything, doesn't have to answer questions in parliament. He's not seen for months in parliament. There are no treasury questions. The prime minister comes and says something and goes off. There's nothing happening. Then the president appoints various officials secretary to the Ministry of Finance, the governor of the central bank, the monetary board, the key levers of fiscal, monetary policy making in the country are all done without any kind of accountability in the presidential secretariat. Now, remember, we didn't get to this overnight. This was not some sort of thing that we all knew. It was a slow-moving car crash that was happening, right? Anybody who knows anything, as a citizen about general knowledge about economics, like me, I'm not like you, an expert on these things, but people like you were warning us, at the time, in that sort of initial round of unsustainable tax cuts soon after the new president assumed office. Economists like you were saying these things, and we were listening to all of this. But nothing could be done because there is the presidential system has no checks and balances, is not accountable. So there is nothing you can stop until the next election comes. But this was so bad that well before our next election, the people had to get on the streets to halt this disastrous economic path that was being taken. I mean, any person who does even A-level economics would know that printing money causes inflation. And so on. And you had the governor of the central bank calling press conferences saying that this doesn't happen. 300 years of, that's not economic ideology. That's just economic facts. And you could do nothing about it. This is what we will change in a parliamentary executive. A finance minister who says nonsense like that is going to be immediately brought before parliament. We will see that person being questioned, the prime minister being questioned, the finance minister being questioned in the well of the house. There will be committees that go into economic, policy in great detail, where the government just can't ignore these things. They have to account and they have to deal with these things. So, arguably, I'm willing to make this point very, very strongly, that if we had a more accountable parliamentary executive rather than a presidential system, even an incredibly incompetent government like the Gotabaya Rajapaksa administration could have been stopped much earlier before it inflicted this level of damage. It is the presidential system that has permitted such an incompetent administration to take us to where we are. And then the institutional system did nothing to it. It was the people who had to get on the streets to do something about it. And ideally, that is not how we should be running a country. Parliament has to be able to check an executive. We could have brought the government down on budgets. We could have brought the government down on confidence votes. We could have created the atmosphere where the government has to, at the very least, moderate its more crazy ideas. All of these things are possible within a parliamentary system, which are not possible in a presidential system.
Can I ask you to elaborate further on this particular observation of mine? I mean, over the years, what I have seen in Sri Lanka is that you have a kitchen cabinet that pretty much runs this country. And the entire public service is beholden to the executive. I mean, they have been weakened, they are not independent, the caliber has been very weak, and the politicians call the shots, the civil servants are quite literally servants. Will this proposed new constitution change that architecture? Will we have to bring in new legislation like restoring the former Ceylon civil service to bring a very capable administrative system?
Two steps to answering that question. The first thing is, as a constitutional amendment, is it conscious of this problem and does it do something about it? Answer is yes. Because when we bring back the Constitutional Council and restore the independence of particularly the Public Service Commission and so on, we go some way towards restoring the professionalism, independence and impartiality of the civil service. The moment you start doing that kind of thing, because of course there are bigger problems which have debilitated the capacity of our civil service, but there is still capacity there. But when you don't have the job security and the guarantees of impartiality there, civil servants are cowed by overmighty political executives, right? And so even good advice that might come from the system does not do that. So all of that kind of problem can be, the institutional response to that is being done by the reintroduction of the Constitutional Council, ensuring that appointments and disciplinary control of the civil service and of the treasury, bringing the central bank governor and the monetary board into that independent appointments and dismissal framework. These are all important things at the level of the Constitution. But your question is broader, in my view. So do we need to contemplate further reforms? Of course. I think there is legislation necessary for doing all sorts of other things, for building the capacity of the civil service, the economic aspects of it particularly. We need legislation for things like an independent budget office, office on national statistics, all these things. We need to build the capacity of Parliament to perform its role of financial oversight much better than it does now. So what all that the amendment does is, at the level of the Constitution, start taking us in the right direction and establish the core institutions there. That means that we have to take it from there and build on it. Even if the 21st Amendment succeeds, that is not the end of the story. Rebuilding our institutions damaged, and quite frankly, it's not only the Rajapaksas who've done that. No, I mean that this decay has started in the 1960s, 70s with the politicization, excessive politicization, and the socialists were responsible for this. They thought that they need to bring fellow Marxists in the cabinet, in line with fellow Marxists in the civil service, in order to affect the socialist revolution. This is where politicization began. It was never reversed. The destruction of the abolition, in fact, of the elite Ceylon civil service was one of the worst things that we did to ourselves. A thing that India and Singapore never did. So all these things we can bring back. We need that. Those need not be done by the Constitution. Those can be done by legislation and whatever else that is needed to ensure that we have, especially at the top, civil servants who are appropriately qualified, with appropriate expertise, with appropriate integrity, and all of these things, who are paid extremely well. At least to the level of a comparable CEO in the private sector, so that you get both quality and you totally take away the incentive for corruption. All these things we have to do.
Our system of parliament is a unicameral system. Most countries have bicameral systems. There is a feature in the 21st Amendment that talks about Council of State. What do you think the drafters thought about why that feature has come about?
Yes, that's a really interesting question. It's one of the most novel and innovative things. It's one of the new things that the 21st Amendment will actually bring, because that has never been a part of our previous constitutions at all. So,
can I just stop you there and ask, historically, why was our system only unicameral? Why didn't we have a state? I mean, a Senate. Why don't we have a bicameral system?
Sure.
I will. Yeah. So I was going to say that it was interesting that when you read the proposals, Murtaza, that you thought about the link between the Council of State proposal and a second chamber or a Senate. That is the way I think about it as well. And of course, we had a Senate between 1948 and 1971 when it was abolished. That Senate, very few people will defend it because it was not seen to be doing its job very well. But that's a design problem. It was an appointed Senate. So, I mean, you just, the government of the day appoints its friends and cronies there and do that. It doesn't have to be like that. We can have, and I think in principle, in future, we absolutely, at a different next phase of constitutional reform, the 21st Amendment deals only with abolition and with the independent commissions, Constitutional Council, and these things. We are not dealing with electoral system. We are not dealing with devolution. We don't deal with the Bill of Rights. And we are not dealing with the second chamber. That's for at some other point, once the economic stabilization has happened and we can have those longer, deeper conversations, let's come back to all of that. So in that context, how do we ensure that a unicameral parliament that is made up of entirely elected and appointed politicians, nationalists, as well as a government, parliamentary executive that is chosen from that, can have the benefits of something like a Senate? Because one of the purposes of having a Senate or a second chamber in democratic countries is to infuse this expertise into the legislative process, right? To bring people with economic expertise, academics of political science, of constitutionalism, international relations, all of these people into the conversation. In the future, a second chamber would have to play that role. But in the meantime, and since there is now, in the context of not only Gota go home and Rajapaksa's go home, but all the 225 also better go home kind of atmosphere that prevails, I think it will be very difficult to start talking about second chambers. So I think the intention here has been, you establish a much smaller body called the Council of State. Now, it comes from the kind of French tradition, the Conseil d'État, which used to be there to advise the French president, and even before that, actually, the French king. But that has been now taken and adapted in the Commonwealth English-speaking tradition as well. Started by the Irish Republic, Irish Free State, where the Constitutional Council, the Council of State actually functions extremely well. And a number of other places where you find Malta, a number of other places where this is Singapore. It's not exactly called that; it's called something else. But the model, the mechanism is the same. Idea is you have a core group of ex officio members: Prime Minister, Ministers of Finance, Defense, Foreign Affairs, the key minister, the core officers in the cabinet. The leader of the opposition, probably another person to represent the other parties in parliament. And different countries do different things. Some bring the Chief Justice in, others feel that the judges have no clue, you don't have to bring that in. 21st Amendment does not propose that. The Attorney General is definitely in. So this is the sort of officials. And then you have a majority membership of highly distinguished economic independent experts to represent business, economics, political science and constitutional law, international law and relations. We can even think of others like trade unions and so on also, where we bring that. Ireland is very strong on that, where it brings both businesses as well as trade unions into the same policy-making conversation in the Council of State. And the idea here is that these will be very distinguished people who will not go there because they have contributed to the party in power during election time. That's not the model here, right? This is not rewarding cronies. This is civic-minded citizens with a contribution of expertise to give to national life, who will now have an institutionalized forum in which to discuss, interact, and advise on policy matters to all these key people at the highest reaches of the state. Even now, you find these debates happening in the newspapers, on social media, through think tanks like Advocata. You have these conversations. You sometimes have ministers or other MPs there. You have conversations with academics and other experts and so on, but those are all informal. Those are all civil society initiatives. They don't have a institutionalized space. So the idea here is the Council of State will bring 12 such eminent people into the policy-making process of the government, where it is discussed. And of course, although formally, because you don't want to set up a rival to the cabinet, right? The cabinet is ultimately the constitutional body that makes decisions. It is necessary, therefore, that legally you have to make that advice of the Council of State non-binding. But the assumption and the way that it functions in every other country where it does function is that there's a very strong, it's very hardly ever does a government ever reject the good advice of the Council of State. It will almost change its policy when it is told that you're not doing a good thing, right? And imagine the situation where the government nonetheless thinks, right, we have received this advice, but in cabinet we'll go and discuss this, and as a collective cabinet decision, no, we will stick to our course and we will reject the advice of the Council of State. The government is entitled to do that. But what that means then is the experts in the Council of State are then entitled to go out and say, this is what we advised, this is instead what the government is doing, these are the dangers, these are the pitfalls, right? And that way it adds. So a member of the Council of State saying this in a public forum will add to public debate, to parliamentary debate, and so on, in a much stronger way than if just an independent think tanker is saying this. I'm not taking anything away from independent think tankers. My history is also in them. But I think we can use this, and we have this great need right now, particularly because of the extremely incompetent and unresponsive nature of governance in the last 2.5 years that has led us to this crisis, and the realization by the people that we just can't do governance like this anymore. That this is a country with incredible talent, both within and outside. People who are more than willing to spend a lot of time giving their, world-class expertise to national life. Why aren't we making use of these people? So I think this is a way of doing that.
And this Council of State, 12 people who will be appointed, how will they be selected and what will be their term of office?
That's right. Very, very good point. The 21st Amendment itself does not provide for that yet, but because that was because there was a huge hurry, I think. And my understanding from my discussions about it with the people in the know is that, again, like with the other things, like the civil service matters, the legislation will provide for it. And I think the strong preference would be, an inevitable preference would be, that these members, the independents, would be appointed by the Constitutional Council and appointed for a relatively long term, such that they're not attached to one government, right? So if you have a long, so the term of Parliament is 5 years. So if you have a Council of State term of 7 years or 8 years or even 10 years, if somebody is willing to give that much of a commitment, then you ensure that at least across two governments that these independent experts are there. And that's, remember, also the value of continuity. So even if a government goes out at the next election and a new one comes in which is relatively inexperienced and has not had previous experience in government, etc., they have a ready source of sound advice waiting for them in the Council of State.
Okay. So Asanga, from what we have discussed today, the very nature of the state is going to change. So there was two other issues I wanted to discuss now. Parliament is going to become more important. In our current system, it has a secondary role, because it's the executive that has the power. Now, under these proposed changes, the character of Parliament is going to change. Would we need different kind of parliamentarians? Do you think that the process of how these parliamentarians get selected, fundamentally the electoral system itself will have to change, so that the type of people who run for office are going to be a different type of person, and the electoral politics has to change, that you won't need so much of money, because currently in our current system it's a very expensive process and no one individual perhaps has the resources to fund it invariably. So they have to rely on donations, and this political campaign funding comes with certain attachments and certain expectations. So do you think the whole electoral system will also have to be changed to complement this new system?
Yes, as I think briefly mentioned in my somewhere earlier, definitely. I mean, electoral reform is something that we absolutely need to do. Electoral reform has to go in the direction of a mixed member proportional style system, like we have in Scotland, like we have in Germany. So that kind of system, broadly speaking, is one where there is a certain component of members of the lower house who are elected in small constituencies through the first past the post system. So that in small constituencies, you lower the costs of election and all of that. It restores the link between the direct local MP and the electorate. And then you balance the need for the proportionality of the overall parliamentary representation, because we are a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural country. We need to ensure that as well, because the FPTP system is majoritarian and in a sense disfavors minority representation. So we need both. So this mixed system so that's in principle, I think many people are agreed on that, except that the devil is in the detail. There are a number of, there was a huge debate in the previous Yapalne period about this, and in fact even more, nearly the whole process got derailed because of the lack of agreement on the detail of the electoral system. So we'll have to return to that debate. There's no shortcut out of it. But I want to concentrate on the question that you asked in relation to electoral system. How is it that we make all of these changes, the parliament becomes a much more different institution, a much more important one, and also we will have very different expectations from parliament. It can't be a place where these people who have just go there, shout at each other, waste time. They're not debates, they're not conversations. There is no little discussion of policy. And then go off, and all of this is true of the current parliament. But partly the reason is because the stakes are so low. It doesn't really matter, because real decision making happens somewhere else. So that will all change in a parliamentary system, and that obviously means that in order for a parliamentary system to work well, the kind of personnel that we have there have also to change. And of course, there we can't at one level abdicate our responsibility as electors, and as we are the guys who put them there. No? So if you are sending thuggish people or corrupt people there, we also have to sort of say we are not going to do this anymore. But at the same time, the systems are also important. So one dimension is the electoral system that enables people who are otherwise excluded to be able to join the political process, to encourage, and a second chamber particularly can encourage experts to be appointed through some sort of process, so that they're there in people who don't have the time or the inclination to actually go and campaign and get elected, but who are nonetheless important to the policy making role, expertise that we can bring in through the Senate into that. We need to have all of that. So how to improve the quality of these people? Electoral system is one. The whole sort of recalibration, the role of parliament is one. We need thorough-going reform of our political finance arrangements. We need a new act, basically. And all of our electoral laws, parliamentary referendum, all of these things have to change and be updated. But political finance has to be based, and there are a number of initiatives going on, I know, among the people who work on these areas, including myself and my team, where we have looked at a number of comparative experiences that are very relevant for us: Singapore, Australia, Singapore, UK, and India, and so on, where both anti-defection, right? You disincentivize this practice of corrupt or opportunistic crossovers for money, bribe. Everybody knows what's happening, but nobody can stop it. That can be stopped, and the 21st Amendment will stop it. But it has to be sort of buttressed with this whole point about campaign finance and political finance regulation for both cash matters as well as in-kind things. Because remember, it's not only money handed over in cash, between the candidate and his or her donor. It's also in-kind stuff. So if a media house is providing, advertising space free of charge to a candidate, that is also a contribution. So all of these ways we need modernizing. So after the 21st Amendment, there is a hell of a lot more regulatory work to be done, without which it will become what the 19th Amendment became. Right, 19th Amendment, in that sort of initial 3 months, there was all this excitement about this change of government. In January 2015, we managed to pass the 19th Amendment, and I think the signs of it going awry were already there by that time, and then nothing happened. So we can't make that mistake this time. The constitutional changes are the first step. Then there is a whole series of other things, from legislation to regulations to parliamentary standing orders, all of these sort of rules that have to change in order for the whole system to change along with it. And my last point is, rules and institutions can change behaviors. So I think even people sometimes who misbehave in parliament and who have a terrible reputation as a crook or a thug or whatever, in my experience, you often find when they're in a different environment, when you engage them in a different way, they almost seem like completely different people who are much more thoughtful and intelligent and, all of that kind of stuff. So institutions do change behaviors. And I think even among some of these people who we have got accustomed to misbehaving in very bad ways as politicians may well change. And of course, in the next election, there is the opportunity, I think, if this sort of great moment that we have created around golf survives, and if we remember as a society that this is what we were trying to do, I think the next elections could turn out to be a quite a different one from everything that we have seen in the past, with a very new, fresh crop.
I certainly can vouch for your comment about, the same politicians under very different circumstances are very different people. Yes. Because in Advocata, we engage with politicians across the aisle. And on a one-on-one basis, they take a very different character and flavor. So exactly. Finally, Asanga, one last point I would like to explore with you is that how does this 21st Amendment come into being? Now, where is it now, and what are the next steps that have to happen?
That's right. Excellent question. I mean, much of the answer to that question is political rather than legal or rules, right? And let me just instead of sort of talking to you in if this happens, and if that happens, kind of thing, just explain to you what the framework I think is for making this work. And it's as follows: we need to change the government. There has to be the parliamentary politics have to be done by the opposition and all concerned, including the independent group, the second group that has split away from the SLPP, everybody else in parliament. This is a national moment. We have to do that. We have to start behaving like adults. It is very, very clear that we are not going to address the cry from the heart that we have seen from the streets and from the protests if we start making deals with the Rajapaksas. So the first thing to agree on this is that the two Rajapaksas who are remaining at the top of government have to go or be removed. So the first way to do that is the construction of the 113 alternative majority that is needed to be able to, if the Prime Minister does not resign, then you pass a vote of no confidence in him so that he's dismissed and his government is dismissed. So that 113 then also becomes, while you're doing that, you also think about what that alternative government would be. For me, it would have to be, because of the way that the numbers fall in the current parliament, it will have to be, and this will disappoint a lot of protesters, have to include a SLPP, SLFP people. But hopefully not those who are directly tainted by what has gone on in the last 2.5 years. And there are people like that. But a small cabinet that will have to replace after Mahinda Rajapaksa is either resigned or dismissed. And that government we can't think about it, and it cannot run in an orthodox way, right? That it has a new 113 plus, and then it does everything on its own, nothing like that. And then it basically functions with the current president, because the president also has to go, and I'll come back to how we do that in a moment. The first thing is the new cabinet and prime minister have to be backed up by what is known as a supply and confidence arrangement. And that is where a sufficient number of parties that takes the number over 113 get together and say, right, this is a minority government, but we give you, through a memorandum of understanding or a coalition agreement or whatever you may call it, some kind of political agreement. Let's call it an MOU. For an agreed period of time, we ask you to form this government, get on to the immediate questions to do with dealing with the IMF and all of the economic measures that have to be given. We have no time to lose on that. We will ensure that you are not brought down in a vote of confidence. We will ensure that your appropriations measures are supported through. We will give you support for the legislation that is needed for the economic recovery, right? So this new government, which is small and may not on its own have the ability to summon a majority, but will nonetheless have a very broad-based, MOU-based, broad base of parliamentary support based on certain principles focusing on the economic recovery. So the SJB will remain in opposition, the other parties will remain in opposition, and they will perform an opposition job. But when it comes to key votes and all of that, in terms of the MOU, for an agreed period, it may be 12 months, it may be 18 months, you provide the votes necessary to keep the government in power and therefore give that stability, right? So this kind of unorthodox MOU-based supply and confidence arrangement has a number of benefits. It brings the immediate stability that we need. It gets rid of the Rajapaksas immediately. One Rajapaksa, I'll come to the other one. We enable a government to start addressing the economic thing. The government can call upon a wide array of parliamentary support that gives it both a stability and a kind of national character. And that's the way we start both the intensive care measures that are needed for on the economic front, as well as over time then start rebuilding confidence in the economy and start stabilizing the situation. At some point in the future, the arrangement can be abrogated. Everybody goes back to politics as normal. That's a different matter. But for now, this is how we do this. Now, that is how we replace the cabinet and the prime minister. What about the president? Now, when this kind of thing starts happening and the consensus is very, very clear that the Rajapaksas have to go, I hope even at that point, and especially after the elder brother has gone, that the younger brother will see the writing on the wall and gracefully resign. That will be then well and good. If the president does not resign, we can start bringing confidence resolutions, which are non-binding, of course, and of no legal effect. But you can start cutting off supply, cutting off money to the presidential secretariat, all of that kind of stuff. You can remove his staff. You can reduce him to an absolute nothing when you are in control of parliament. And that is what we will try to do. In the meantime, what also happens, building on the momentum that we have created with this sort of very new way of getting out of the deadlock, is to get the consensus of the 150 MPs that are needed. This is not going to be easy. I'm going through this very fast, but I don't assume that it is easy, but it is something that we have to do, right? The politics is the art of the possible. We have done this before. This situation is very unprecedented. We have to get to that. So the SJB and opposition's 21st Amendment bill has to be passed. If the referendum is not needed, this can be done within 5 weeks at the most, because there is a Supreme Court inquiry in the middle and all of that, and then the parliamentary debate and a vote and all of that. But that will take as little as 5. If the Supreme Court orders a referendum, nothing more than 2 to 3 months is what you need. But we need to work assiduously on that, apply the pressure, charm, cajoling, whatever that is needed to get to that 150. Because unless we use this moment to enact that amendment and make the system change, explicitly system change, Kramaya Venaskaramu, Kramaya Peralamu, is something that we have seen in the protests. This will, over time, with some half-hearted measures, we will sort of start going back to normal over a while, and all the rest of it. The immediate cost of living issues might get addressed and whatever, and then it will be absolutely business back to normal, and we would have gained nothing at all. So it is absolutely crucial that I think, as the intelligentsia as well as the general public, that we keep up the pressure for the kind of strategy that I have mentioned. And that is what everybody must get together. The Rajapaksas have to go. A new government, which is unlike anything that we have seen before, but on the basis of a confidence and supply arrangement, has to come in. It has a broad national basis in terms of the parties that will support. And then the 21st Amendment has to abolish presidentialism, bring in all the other changes to the system. And then we focus entirely after that, for the next 12 to 24 to even a little longer than that months, on the very, very, very painful things that we will have to do with our economy. And then once that stabilizes, we will think about returning to politics as normal, having general elections and all of that.
I think Henry Kissinger, I think, once mentioned about policy that is formed in the minds of few but not in the hearts of many. Do you think that this amendment to the Constitution has to be sold to the public? Is anybody doing that?
I'm very frustrated, I think, with the political parties who have so far, so-called sponsored the bill. But I have not seen them doing enough to explain the contents of the bill to at least their supporters, if not the general public. Communicate. This is what we are doing. This is why we are doing it. These are the benefits that it will bring. This is the connection with your economic problems right now, and these changes. It is not remotely not enough. So it therefore falls, I suppose, on civil society and think tanks and others also to do something. We should keep up the pressure on the opposition political parties to do more. They at least need to have 3 or 4 people among their ranks who have the capacity to understand this and go and explain this through the media, use social media, do all of this kind of thing. It is not at all sufficiently happening. There is no question about that. It's been a week now, and very few people know what it is. And in terms of events or other initiatives to explain the contents, that has entirely happened by people who are not members of any of these political parties. It has happened because young groups like the Centenary Movement or hashtag, your institution now, that's where it's happening, and that's not sufficient.
And finally, Asanga, you're born in this country, lived in this country, worked in this country.
I'm still a citizen of it.
Yes, you're a citizen. The economic catastrophe that we are facing in this country is not like any other since our post-independence. Do you believe that it is the greatest opportunity that we have for many generations to reset the trajectory of the future of this country?
I believe so, Murtaza, and in this, obviously, I am led by the superior knowledge of people I listen to and read, including the output of your organization, and I do believe, like the kind of constitutional renewal that I am in a position and have the competence to talk about. I think we what has happened to us for 70 years is that. In Sinhalese, they say rola gahagane yana. We have always managed to do that. No, we never take tough decisions from one election to another. You will recall that you mentioned Kissinger's great phrase, but you will recall the James Jupp, the great Australian political scientist who said in the 1970s that the Sri Lankan elections are a periodic auction of non-existent resources. And that is exactly what we have been doing.
I thought it was Lee Kuan Yew also who said that.
He may have, yeah, but it was James Jupp very, very much who said that in the Sri Lankan context. And LKY may have been actually quoting Jupp, because Jupp was very influential in the sort of Australian Pacific development studies world at that time. But yes, I do. Yeah, the short answer to your question is, I think the fundamentals of what we need to do are, I mean, not rocket science, given how we have got here by cowardice and stupidity and corruption. It's not because we have economic problems that are insurmountable. So the structural and policy changes will have to happen. We'll hopefully do the institutional ones. And I think this is, in some senses, a brutal thing to say, but a very good thing to happen, because we actually had to run out of petrol for us to realize that we just can't carry on in the way that we have for 70 years. So I just hope that the fundamentals of the intangible infrastructure of our future economic prosperity are laid at this moment. Well, it'll be the immediate phase, as well as then after the next election, a new government, how it starts rebuilding in a much more sort of systematic way. And of course, obviously, we have so many comparative examples in Asia to look to and learn from. And yes, I do believe that it is definitely a wonderful opportunity, and probably we have never got this opportunity, because at one level, we haven't suffered enough in the past to be able to take the far-reaching measures, and this one is going to be very painful. So maybe this is the time.
So, as far as being painful for us living in this country on a daily basis, we are feeling the pain. Today, the Sri Lankan rupee was trading something like 360 to 370, which is a depreciation of over 75%, and the shock is yet to come through. So, on a personal note, I mean, if Asanga's healthy debate about the 21st Amendment came through, I believe that the most important part is the republic. After all, we are a republic, and the republic is about equality, that there has to be fraternity, that there has a sense of brotherhood, and most important, liberty. And Advocata is a libertarian, free-thinking think tank. So on that note, Asanga Welikala, thank you very much for participating in today's Advocata conversation, and we wish you the very best and have a good day.
Thank you, Murtaza. Great pleasure.